Good morning, scholars, and welcome again to another presentation in the series in the class History of the Christian Church. May the good Lord, who is kind to all of us, be with us as we review these facts together. The title of our presentation today is The Frankish Rulers and the Church. And we will soon learn how the Frankish rulers played a key role in the life of the church, especially as the church comes to the end of the period under discussion, the period that ends in 800 AD. Like any other presentation, let's put this into context. This is history of the Christian church. And the Christian church is in two sections. There is a church in the West led by the Bishop of Rome, who is now officially being addressed as the Pope, and also the Bishop of Constantinople, who is directly working under the Emperor in the New Rome, which is Constantinople. Now, you will realize, if you have not already realized, that the Christian church and activities of the Christian church in the history of the church is centered in the West. And this is because in the East, the activities of the church are so much under the state. It's a department of the state. So their growth is very, very minimal, while in the West, if you remember, when Constantine went to the East and the emperors now were in the East, the only powerful person who remained in the West, who could unite and who had a territory and who had followers, was the Pope. The Pope in Rome, the Bishop of Rome. Now, the context of this presentation comes in the sense that there are now forces that are pressing on the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, forces that are so strong that the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, is feeling that he cannot survive alone. He needs help. Now, the forces included, among those forces that were pressing against the Pope, were forces coming from the Islamic believers. You would remember in the previous lessons we've covered, Muslim has now become a strong force. By 750, they had literally conquered territory after territory. The northern part of Africa that had Alexandria, that had Carthage, where there was a stronghold of Christianity, all of it was gone. The part where Christianity had begun, and that is Jerusalem, Antioch, that territory was gone to the Muslims. Now the Muslims were approaching, they had conquered Spain already, and they were now entering into France to continue their activities of conquering and turning people from Christianity into Muslim faith. So this had become a force, and the Pope now, the Bishop of Rome, had to ask himself, how does he survive this force that had come? At this time, the church in the Eastern, under the emperor there in Constantinople, was not yet taken over by the Muslims, but they were now coming into Western Europe via Spain. The second force that the Pope was feeling were the Lombards. The Lombards were who were in Milan, were very pushy pushing for Arianism, and that's the doctrine that was being taught by Arius of saying Jesus was a created being and he did not belong to God. This is against the Orthodox position. These groups were getting stronger and stronger, and they were a threat to the mainstream church led by the Bishop of Rome. The third, there was the contest by the Bishop of Constantinople, who constantly wanted to claim that he had the same power, if not more power, than the Bishop of Rome. And then the forces to be loyal to the emperor from Constantinople, because at this time, there was only one emperor, that is the one residing in the New Rome in Constantinople in the east. Now, with all these forces on the Bishop of Rome, the Pope now has to find somebody who will be a helper, somebody who would come as an ally and help the Pope either stop or win over these forces that he was now contending with. That help came through Clovis. Clovis was the first leader to unite the Franks. Now, who are the Franks? Who are these people? The Franks are a group of people whose history is so important because when they came up from the civilization of the Gaul by Caesar in the middle of the 1st century before Christ. Now they had become a stronger people, and they followed in the territory where they now settled in the present homeland of France. They had moved to the point where, while other activities were going on, they had built into a strong people, and now led by Clovis, who was the first leader to unite the Franks. Clovis, as the first leader, a very brilliant person, married a Burgundian princess in order to expand his territory of influence. So far, what we are discussing is this group of people, the Franks, who now the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, will now turn to and make him an ally, so that with this group being on his side, the Pope may be able to now face the challenges he's facing. Fortunately, Clovis became a Christian in 496, fortunately for the Christian faith. And when Clovis became a believer and accepted Christianity, he immediately began working actually to expand Christianity. Clovis accepted Christianity partly through the influence of his wife and partly because of what appeared to be providential aid given to him in the battle that he had. And when he accepted Christianity, the Franks who were now under him, who he had united as their ruler, became the bulwark or the backbone of the papacy, both for temporal, in other words, both for protection from the enemies, as well as for the expansion of the territory over which the Pope was the spiritual leader. In other words, once Clovis became a Christian, the Frankish people that he was ruler over became easy targets for Christianity, and many of them became Christians, even though a good number were Christians. But now with him becoming a Christian, he could now, with his military, protect the Pope. And on the side of the Pope, This becomes such an advantage because the Pope's influence has just expanded. Now, as it would be when Clovis died, his sons could have become the rulers, and they did take over power, but they were weak. And so power shifted and went to the mayors of the palace who took over the state affairs. And these mayors of the palaces made up of what is known as the Carolingian Dynasty, which was now to reach its zenith of power in the progression of these rulers who were the mayors of the palace. Now the transition here is Clovis, his sons come in, they are not able to provide the kind of quality leadership he had provided. These mayors of the palace take over, and these mayors and their leadership or rulership of the Frankish people now is what becomes known as the Carolingian Dynasty, and they are known as the Carolingian leaders. The first one of this is Pippin of Heristo, who was the first of the mayors of the palace and worked to unite and continue the work of Clovis. And from 687 to 714, he controlled the Franks and continued to provide leadership that was needed. Following him came Charles Martel, sometimes called Charles the Hammerer. This Charles the Hammerer was an illegitimate son of Pippin, the first one, who took over duties of the palace after 714. Now, this man, Charles Martel, has one major thing he does that is so significant to the Pope of Rome and to the Christian church, because he was a warrior. He was a warlike man, and he fought a lot of wars. One of the wars which he fought was the Battle of Tours in 732. Now, you need to remember this because this is important. As a warrior, a man of war, he meets with the Muslim military people, or rather, the Muslim faith. Sometimes you call them military because they were very militant. They were conquering by sword. He meets them as they come from Spain, going up now into France. He meets them at the Battle of Tours in 732, and he defeats the Muslims, bringing them to a complete stop from progressing into Western Europe, or the conquest of Western Europe. Now, this is very important to keep in mind because they have been coming via North Africa, where they've conquered Egypt, they've conquered all the territories, and they now cross into Spain. They conquer Spain, but when they come as they want now to enter into France, they meet Charles Martel, the Hammerer, who defeats them, and this is what stopped the Muslims now from further penetration into Western Europe, saving Western Europe from Islamic domination, or from the followers of Muhammad converting people from Christianity into Islam, as they had done in other territories, including Jerusalem. The person who followed, the successor of Charles, in this group of the mayors of the palace, was his son, Pippin, known as Pippin the Short or Pippin the Great. Pippin the Great is an interesting person in the sense that when he took over the leadership of the Frankish people, he does something that strengthens the influence and the capacity in territory of the Pope. Now, you always will hear me say this. There is a lot of history. There's the history of the Frankish people. There's the history of the English people. You notice that I skim. In other words, I only pick up points, even under these leaders, of what it is they did that contributed to the history of the Christian church, because this is a course in the history of the Christian church. Now, here is what this man did. Charles Martel stopped the Islamic forces, or the Mohammedans, the followers of Muhammad. Pippin the Great, who comes in, he redeemed his promise to aid the Pope by expeditions against the Lombards in 754 and 756. Remember, the Lombards are those people who were propagating the Arian belief that Christ Jesus is a creature and not a creator, not equal to God. So this man now helps in fighting and suppressing those. He goes a step further. He promised land in central Italy from Rome to Ravenna to the Pope in 754. Now, this is very important because this becomes the beginning of the Pope now owning large pieces of land that will now become part of the issues the church and the state will be dealing with as we go into the future of the Christian church. This grant, which is known as the donation of Pippin, had special significance for the people of Rome because in 754 BC, now this is 754 AD when he makes this promise, but in 754 BC, the Roman Empire had this as the date which was traditionally for the founding of the city of Rome. In the same year, now he makes this promise to the Pope with a donation of a piece of land, a large territory. This allotment was the foundation for the papal state which the Pope held uninterruptedly in Italy until the union of the Italian people in 1870. Now, this explains the situation even today where the Pope still has a piece of land. We will come to that in later presentations. Now, this donation of Pippin is interesting in that actually it is believed, and the document in history seem to attribute the documentation as, or the history rather seems to imply that there was some foul play. To strengthen this gift of Pippin, it was believed also that no, this was actually promised by Constantine when he was emperor, and a document was generated that read the donation of Constantine so that it strengthened this gift. But whatever the case is, this gift was given now to the Pope, a piece of land. Now, keep in mind, the Pope was a spiritual leader. Okay, remember the earlier lessons we had learned. The Pope was a spiritual leader. But now, the Pope is owning land as belonging to him in similar manner as the Frankish kings or the other kings had owned land. Following Pippin the Great came Charlemagne, Charles the Great, whose life or whose span of life is from 742 to 814. He came to the throne in 768, and this man, Charlemagne, Charles the Great, raises the entire Western section, covering France and going into Germany, into Italy. He actually works to unite that. Obviously, the Carolingian Dynasty had become the most powerful, to the extent that in 800, that's on the Christmas Eve, in the year 800, Emperor Leo, actually, something happens, and it's interesting to notice this. Leo was having some issues with the church in Rome, where he was bishop or pope, to the extent that he could have been killed, but he escapes and runs and goes to Charlemagne, who is now the ruler of the Frankish people under the Carolingian Dynasty. And Charlemagne travels and brings him to Rome and helps reinstall him, as it were, into his power or his position as Pope. Now, if you follow this, then you realize that here is a king, Charlemagne, and by the way, Charlemagne had a very imposing stature. He was a very tall man, over 7 feet tall, and he was equally huge. He was a giant, and he was known as a man of war. During his reign, he engaged in more than 50 campaigns, 50 wars, which led him to expand his kingdom, including defeating the Lombards, defeating part of Germany, conquering the Saxonies, entering into Italy. He just conquered. He just conquered until during the Christmas Eve, when he had come to help reinstall Pope Leo back into authority. When he was installed, naturally now Leo feels he owes Charlemagne, because Charlemagne has helped him to consolidate his threatened power, in which he was almost killed. So while they are praying that Christmas Eve, Leo stands up with a crown and puts it on the head of Charlemagne, crowning him as the Emperor of Rome, or the Emperor of the Roman people. This was so significant because there was only one emperor who was out in Constantinople. Now, this side of the church, in the western side, a person, in this case Charlemagne, is crowned as the emperor, calling him in very pronounced way, as he put the crown on him, Imperito Romanam. Imperito Romanorum, meaning the emperor of Rome. Now, when this takes place, obviously, as students of Christian history, you see how there is now interplay of the church helps the state helps the church, and this now began playing on the very issue of the state and the church, to the extent that this man, Charlemagne, who obviously, while letting the Pope know that he's a spiritual leader, Charlemagne wanted to make it clear that the ruler was him, Charlemagne. He believed, one would say, that the church was responsible for spiritual leadership, but that the church is subordinate to the head of the state. Now, as we go into future lessons, you will see how the popes sometimes will struggle with this because of the struggle of power, the mixture of where does this one end, where does this one start? So Charlemagne comes up with this concept of saying the state is like the body of a human being. The church is like the soul, signifying that the church has its role, the soul. Spiritual formation is its emphasis, or spiritual affairs. But the state is like the body. It protects the soul. It keeps the soul. Now, this became a very interesting way of actually working together with the state and the church. The critical issues, some of which I have actually covered, the donation of Pippin, Charlemagne being crowned, the church as the soul and the state as the body, and Leo III crowning Charlemagne as emperor. Now, how does the church then look like as we come to the end of the 800 AD? Here is a picture of how the church is now coming to the end of this period. The Eastern Church continued under the rule of the emperor there at Constantinople. The church in the East was just a department. They really never came out to be who they were, independent, continuing in the work for which they were established, which is the winning of souls. They just became just like a department of the empire, doing church ceremonies. And this is one reason why the church in the East has never grown or has never contributed as the church in the West has done to Christianity and its growth. Secondly, the Frankish kingdom of Clovis grew into the Christian empire under Charlemagne and united the now Christian on the West. Keep in mind, Charlemagne has conquered many territories, and because he was a Christian and even crowned by the Pope as the emperor, the territory that he covered now becomes the basis for the church now in the West. And this becomes an avenue that the Pope uses now for furthering the work of the church and also for expanding the influence of the Pope. The southern shore of the Mediterranean was lost to Islam. That is the northern part of Africa, which is the southern part of the Mediterranean, was completely lost to Islam. The powers were now resident in four groups. That's in the Frankish Empire, the Church, the Muslim, and the Eastern Emperor, or the Eastern Emperor. As we look at this, and we come to the end of the period, the 800, one cannot help but see how God, working through his church, was sustaining his church, and yet it was not in simple just straightforward way, but the church had to find its way to exist and grow within the context of the state. My hope and prayer is that as a student of history, you will still see the hand of God leading the church in these affairs.